Testing, 1, 2, testing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, testing, 1, 2.
To begin, hi Jackie. To begin, could I invite our new president, Dr. Naomi Hersom, to welcome you.
I'm delighted to have been asked to do this evening. For some of you, you might know that this is an anniversary of sorts for me, because it was just 1 year ago when I was first invited to visit this campus and to be interviewed for the position which I now hold. And I was asked to meet with many people and discuss questions that were put to me. But on the very last morning, just before I was being driven out to the airport, Dean Clark brought me into an auditorium like this one to listen to one of the Seton lectures. And it was during that time that I watched what was happening here at the Mount. There was a group like this, made up of people like yourselves, students, and members of faculty, and members of the Sisters of Charity. And it was the kinds of questions that were being asked from the floor and the kind of dialogue that ensued that impressed me so much. And I said to myself, if I'm to consider coming here to the Mount, it seems to me that this is the kind of community that I would be very pleased to be part of. Well, you know the rest of the story. Here I am. And Dr. Carmody, in welcoming you tonight to the Seton Lecture Series, and all of you, I hope you will find it just as exciting and just as warm and meaningful as I have found it in the past. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Hersom. I'd like to call on Sister Anne Fleming now, please, to introduce us to a little bit of the origin and history of this lecture series.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to have this occasion to speak to you again this year at the beginning of the Elizabeth Seton Lecture Series, which happily this year is being held at the conclusion of the ceremonies welcoming Dr. Hersom as our new president. As many of you know, because you've been regular attenders at the series, the Halifax Province of the Sisters of Charity established an endowment fund in 1978 in order to finance this annual event. We were encouraged to do this by a strong presentation on the part of the sisters who were on faculty here at the Mount at the time. They proposed that an annual lecture series based on the general theme of Christian presence in the world, past, present, future, would enable Mount St. Vincent University to carry on the tradition as stated in its philosophy and objectives. And I quote, "Mount St. Vincent is rooted in a Catholic tradition marked by a strong commitment to understanding truth, intellectual vigor, and social responsibility. The university recognizes the need of moral convictions as the foundation of a worthwhile way of life and seeks to develop in students a willingness to establish a priority of values to enable them to judge, evaluate, and decide in a responsible manner." End of quote. We chose to name these lectures after our foundress, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, and in doing that, we were carrying forward a name which is dear to every Sister of Charity and which holds special significance for the Church in North America. Elizabeth Seton's life as wife, mother, educator, religious foundress, saint, was filled with the same joys, sorrows, challenges, and dreams that women and men experience today too. Her deep faith provided the focus and strength which enabled her to grow in her commitment to understanding the truth intellectual vigor, and social responsibility. I'm sure that she would be an avid listener and strong supporter of our guest speaker, Dr. Denise Lardner Carmody. I would like also to express my gratitude to the faculty of the Religious Studies Department for their expertise and insight shown in planning and carrying out this annual event. The speakers whom they have invited have always been very stimulating. We look forward, Dr. Carmody, to hearing you speak on women and religion, two topics which are of special interest to those of us who are here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister. Friends, on behalf of the Religious Studies Department of the University, I too wish to welcome you here to the Elizabeth Seton Lectures and to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Carmody. There's a story I sometimes tell to my classes for a variety of purposes and to illustrate a whole series of points, obviously, as a good story will do. The story is told in a book by Sarah Maitland, an Anglican, the wife of a priest. The book's title is A Map of the New Country. And it goes like this. There was a small rural congregation which appointed for the first time ever a woman minister. And there was a tradition in the congregation whereby the two male deacons of the church always invited the new minister out for a day's fishing. And so with great trepidation, they invited their woman minister out for a day's fishing, and she very graciously accepted to go. When they had rowed their boat out into the middle of the lake, she realized that she had forgotten her fishing rod. So she apologized, stepped over the side of the boat, and walked across the surface of the water to the shore, picked up the fishing rod, and started to walk back. And one deacon turned to the other and said, "Now, isn't that just like a woman forgetting her fishing rod like that?" The topic of these lectures is women and religion. And if I had more wit, I could probably illustrate the historical relationship between women and religion by two categories suggested by this story. That is, walking on water and not having a fishing rod. But I'm not going to pursue the fishing story any further. The issue of women in religion and in the Christian churches in particular is not a new one. What is new is a certain sense of urgency and a series of consequences of non-response. On the whole, the Christian renewal movement and the women's liberation movement have had very little to say to each other. But the women's issue has been raising challenges in religion and to the churches, and particularly perhaps with regard to their models of ministry. If I could be permitted to modify an image, a traditional image given to us by St. Paul, we might say that right now the body of Christ is a pregnant body, pregnant with new creation, but still very much in labor. We have with us this evening a woman well-versed and involved in the relationship between women and religion. Dr. Denise Lardner Carmody presently chairs the Faculty of Religion at the University of Tulsa in Oklahoma. Perhaps some of you have watched the American news on cable TV this week and seen the floodwaters in Oklahoma. She could use the capacity of walking on the water were she home at the moment. She has been a teacher all her life, an aspect of her career that has been publicly recognized for excellence by her peers. She is widely known through lecturing and by her numerous books, some of which she has produced with her husband John, who is present here with us also, and whom I welcome. In the mid-70s, together they traveled around the world examining the status of women in world religions. Her topic this evening is Women and the Humanization of Society. And the lectures will proceed again tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. She will deal with feminism and Christianity, and tomorrow afternoon at 2 o'clock with women and ministry. After the lecture this evening, there will be a question period, and microphones have been provided if you need them in the aisles. So without further delay, I'd like to present to you Dr. Denise Carmody on Women and the Humanization of Society. Dr. Carmody.
I promise not to read at you, but I do need these for when I refer to the notes. I'm really very grateful to you for inviting me, and for all of you for coming out, especially when there is a game tonight, I've been led to believe. Maybe you're not following the series, but at least for those of you who did make the sacrifice, including both Barry and my husband, I'm quite grateful for your presence. The invitation to come, which came about a year ago, delighted me because I had never been to Nova Scotia, but also pleased me because I had known of the Sisters of Charity and of the great ministry that they perform in the church, and the chance to come to one of their schools and be with them and with you in dialogue was something that I felt I couldn't turn down. So in preparing these remarks for the next 2 days, I very much had an audience like you in mind, people who would be committed to higher education, committed to an active apostolate within the church and within society at large, and alive with the kind of spirit that Mother Seton, Saint Seton, had in her own life and that perdures in the lives of her sisters. So, as we progress, I'd like to spend a few moments before we begin just explaining why the progression of topics is as they are. I had hoped in these next tonight and tomorrow to really dialogue with you, and I invite you to that. There's a way in which, in effect, you're a captive audience, unless you're brave enough to leave, but it's also a very passive role that you play most of the time. You sort of listen. I'd ask you not to just do that, but to hear me and allow the questions that surface because of your listening to arise, and then when we get to the questioning period, either to ask questions, but also to make statements, to agree or disagree or supplement what I'm about to say. I'm beginning tonight with this topic of women and the humanization of society, and the idea here really is to take the large picture. Each time then, after this, we'll get progressively more specific with the idea of feminism, which I define as championing of women's equality in terms of their humanity, and the compatibility of feminism and Christianity, and then more specifically still tomorrow afternoon with the idea of women and ministry in society at large, and specifically within the church. But my reason for beginning on the wider note, which really will be from prehistoric times down to the present, although I will keep it to an hour, I promise, is to help us avoid that narrowness that is pejorative in the sense of seeing the problems of women and society only within terms of Christianity, or specifically only within terms of Catholicism. The problem is much broader than that, and so, too, I think, are the solutions. And then lastly, what I hope to do is, for the most part, focus on the contributions of women not on the various obstacles. Believe me, it is not because I'm not aware of those obstacles. All of us here tonight, I think, are fully aware of them. And I'm not even doing it because I don't believe recounting them is important. I think it is. But I also think that there's a greater importance today for accenting the positive, for talking about the various ways in which women have contributed and are contributing to the humanization of society. So if you have questions about the negative side, other than the little points that I do bring up, I wish you would either state them or raise questions about them when we get to the answering period, question and answer period. With that, I will begin. What I want to do in this next hour is, in effect, sketch out over roughly 8 points, which include a summary, quite briefly and from various viewpoints, the picture of women and the humanization of society. So I'll be touching on points like this: the role of women in prehistoric cultures, the great goddess, women and culture, the feminine persona of wisdom in at least 3 of the world religions, women, children, and nurture, women's opposition to injustice, women's opposition to war, and then a general summary of women and the humanization of society. First 3 topics, then. Each of these, in some way or other, treats women in prehistoric times, either in terms of the actual prehistoric cultures that every time you pick up the New York Times, the age of humanity seems to be pushed back several 100 million years, and the latest is now estimated at probably something like 600 million years ago. 50,000 years ago, we had what we think was the discovery and the first use of fire. 10,000 years ago, we know that people were being buried in fetal positions or in such ways that it indicated at least that there was some sense of either the hope for another life or a return to life or the return to another form of life, but that at least they were being buried ceremonially with flowers, sometimes with articles of food or clothing or jewelry, indicating therefore a kind of concern, that's as much as 10,000 years ago, about both the human person and the possibility of what would happen to that person once death occurred. As you probably realize, 3,000 years ago, you're already into the prophets of the Old Testament, you're into at least the likelihood of the earliest stories and the origins of cities and more communally compacted life. All of this then, although should have been BCE, all of this then indicates life. The scope would have been small-scale, non-technological, pre-literate society. The other facet of that, still giving you just the framework for my remarks, is that pre-literate peoples, the notions of the earliest times, the prehistoric peoples, perdure in terms of those small-scale, non-technological societies that still exist today among traditional Eskimos, American Indians, African tribal groups, etc. So the materials that I'll be drawing on now really come from women's experience in those various cultures. A global view, then. What sorts of things can we say? Well, the best kind of scholarly opinion is that it is highly likely that women in those societies shared and enjoyed an equality economically and religiously that is very unusual, at least for the time span between that early time and our own. Because scholars today argue that the deity, the way in which God was conceived among these early peoples was highly androgynous. There was a sense in which, as Eliade has pointed out, deity among the early peoples very likely had to be both male and female, because the very complementarity of the sexes as they existed in society was seen as so essential for the survival and for the happiness of both men and women. So that God himself, herself, was frequently thought of in androgynous terms. Therefore, the kind of roles that women and men played in their given societies tended to be complementary. Anthropologists indicate this by saying that, for instance, where in the hunting and gathering societies, while men were the hunters, still 90% perhaps of the actual diet of the people was from the gathering side, from the roots and berries and from the earliest forms of what later becomes agriculture, that very likely was the domain of the women. That even in the hunting societies, the women were the ones who beat the bushes to force the game toward the nets or toward the hunters. And that in that kind of cooperative venture, which perdures among peoples like the Pygmies in the Zaire, that kind of cooperation, the kind of economic interdependence between men and women, likely beget a notion religiously of a kind of shared and genuinely complementary endeavor. So that we see among African groups, for instance, that women had parallel societies with the men's societies. Yes, there was sexual segregation, primarily because the taboos that existed then indicated to both men and women that both groups had to be protected because both groups were the centers of power. Men being the center of power being death because they were frequently the warriors. For women, the center of power being life. And that if the taboos were not observed, if, for instance, in religious rituals the sexes were not segregated, the possibility that the power that they both possessed would clash, running amok in the society, causing illness, disease, and other disorders. But the equality between the two was still quite genuine. Now again, I know I'm translating this into our kind of terminology, but in substance, it's a fair enough trade. Because with the women's societies, as we can now study them, they existed the kind of power that meant women had the right to rule. Certainly among their own group, they could elect, or by heredity, they had a selection basis whereby women became, in effect, power brokers, marriage brokers within their societies. They were frequently the healers. They were the ones who were charged with both the presence as midwives at the birth of the new child, but then they followed that child, particularly the girl, through her life until she again would give birth. Many times these societies were matrilineal, meaning that the descent and therefore the inheritance was through the woman's line. Probably, they speculate, because the ability of any child to know the mother is without question. Women become pregnant. Women give birth, all of which would have been public occurrences. Among the earliest peoples, we're fairly sure, the male role in that was hardly understood, and probably for many generations was not understood at all. So women were credited, probably from the beginning, with being the creators of new life. They were the ones then charged with both bringing new life into the world and nurturing that new life through its most formative years. Therefore, you have, in ancient Japan, shamanesses, women shamans, ones who could wield religious power, and usually were among the marginalized women. They were the women frequently blind and therefore doubly marginalized in their societies, who would be apprenticed to an older shaman, and it was believed at a certain point after the kind of initiation that was traditional, the gods, the kami, would take possession of the woman and would regularly come to her whenever she put herself into ecstasy. And she would be the mediator for her people between, in their times of trial, or in their times of death, or in their times of joy. She would mediate between the tribe and the kami. She would bring the news of new birth, or she would accompany the dying soul so that it too could enjoy life in the afterworld. All of this, then, is the result of the most recent kind of anthropological studies. And all of it, and this is a point I'll return to a little later, all of it denies what older anthropologists had believed, and that is the old nurture-nature division, whereby women were supposed to be close to nature and therefore both the custodians, certainly, of the newborn and the early childhood experiences, but that men were the creators of culture, and that the higher forms of intellectual life, the higher forms of society, were really the domain of the male. Groups in Africa like the Sandis, who had their societies from earliest times then, would discount this kind of dichotomy and say that women too, as we begin to study them more carefully, had as many cultural societies as did the men. One of the reasons why anthropologists of earlier generations weren't able to discover that is the simple one that almost all anthropologists were males. So when the men would go into a given tribe and study, they would learn only what the men told them. They could not have access to the women's quarters because the women were segregated. And therefore the activities of the women would, are you all right? Would always remain hidden to the men, and for the most part, probably the men discounted them, saying, well, that's just the women over there having their little coffee klatch. And only with the advent of greater numbers of women anthropologists have we begun to make some strides in discovering what in truth are highly complicated and very well developed women's societies that are politically astute and that have power in many instances, particularly in tribal areas like Africa, that had the ability to roam over great areas of space, following usually the girls that they had at once assisted in their births, following them as they married and moved so that they could be present for the next generation's birth. So in these ways, then, the status of women among these early peoples and perduring down among tribal peoples today is such that it would say there is at least a ground, a framework there, and a basic notion that where women had economic equality, they frequently had religious equality. And where they had economic equality, they usually had some sort of political equality. Again, I'm making broad statements here that we can discuss more fully in the questions. And the notion here then remains that that kind of equality is still in a highly sex-divided and gender-determined society. Another point here is the whole notion of the great goddess, an area of study that has recently gotten a great deal of attention because anthropologists tell us by the various figurines that have been discovered in areas as diverse as all of Western Europe, from Spain across Western Europe over into Siberia, in areas in the Polynesian islands, in areas of Africa, in Australia, figurines of the great goddess have been found. So that this religion, as it's known, although certainly not in any organized form, this cult, this concern for fertility, is global in its expanse. And that as we probe the origins, although of course artifacts are always opaque, we can study them, but what they actually mean in any given culture will remain hidden, because there are, after all, no written records from these times. But what the students of anthropology can tell us is that they indicate that when peoples learned about agriculture, when agriculture became a norm and the nomadic tribes began to lead a more sedentary life, the role of women, and particularly in the form of the great goddess, became quite central to most peoples of the world. And here then, the keynote of fertility and survival shows itself, both again tied to the role of women. Birth, women's role, and therefore agriculture, Mother Earth, giving forth the crops that were needed for survival. In this way then, the various names by which the great goddess is known became, in effect, a kind of overarching worship, love, celebration of the whole life principle. So that you have among, for instance, in the Old Testament, the notion of the Canaanite deities and the Astartes, the feminine figurines, the whole question that has frequently been discussed of temple prostitution, which the Old Testament prophets railed against, and what modern scholars would argue was really a cult of the great goddess, a celebration of life among farming peoples, the Canaanites, who were totally dependent on the sense that they could call upon the female principle for the fertility that their crops needed if they were to flourish and survive. And so that the ceremonies then that we label temple prostitution was really a form of religious worship. It was a celebrating of life, and while of course the ancient Israelites decried it because they felt it was a replacement for or was a blasphemy against Yahweh, there was also a sociological reason why they protested against it, that being that it celebrated matrilineal descent. And Israel was a patriarchal country. A patriarchal people then need to know who the father of the child is, since all the inheritance and the line of legitimacy is through the male. So the idea that there could be no illegitimate children if the great goddess were worshipped was not acceptable in a patriarchal society. In India, the whole notion of the Shakti is a form of the great goddess. Tantrism, where the belief among the gods and goddesses was that the woman possessed the real power. The sexual power was a feminine force, and that once it was controlled by the male, by the god, then beneficial results would occur. So you have within the kind of religious cult in both Hinduism and later in Buddhism, you have a celebrating of sexual intercourse as a religious act, a way in which, in those again male societies, the male could achieve moksha or nirvana by controlling his sexual intercourse to the extent that he derived no pleasure from it, but showed his control of material, his control in this instance of his own body. But here too then, the woman's role is essential, and that at least in the earliest forms it is believed that that kind of male-female interaction shared a sense of equality, even though as the patriarchy developed, the male takes control in greater and greater ways, so that eventually in Hinduism and in Buddhism it is believed that in effect the male is taking power from the woman and she becomes merely the tool of his spiritual enlightenment. All through then the earliest times, and as it perdures down into modern world religions, you have the notion of women tied very directly to her fertility, to motherhood, to the ability to give birth and nurture, tied to the notion that she is key to the survival of the group, tribal and then in larger and larger numbers. She is frequently viewed among peoples as patronesses of agriculture, or of art, or of poetry, or of healing. All of the ways in which it is the feminine, it is the female, who is thought of as the civilizer, as the one who nurtures, as the one who brings life and sustains life, as the one who brings literacy in some groups, as the one who brings the special secret religious rites, as among the Australian Aborigines. And later the men will steal those rights from the women. But they stole them from women. They were first given to women. In all of these ways then, the female, with the notion of fertility, is seen as a key, as absolutely essential, and therefore as equal in all ways to the male to whom she is complementary. In the notion of wisdom, that is the high point of both Judaism, Buddhism, and Taoism, it is interesting to note that the persona there is always feminine. That in the Hebrew Bible, for instance, in Proverbs 8 and 9, we read, the delight of God at the foundations of creation was wisdom. That instructions are given to human beings, and I quote, wisdom has built her house. She has set up her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her beast. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has set out her maids to call from the highest places in the town. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. To him who is without sense, she says, come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Leave simpleness and live and walk in the ways of insight. So that in the Hebrew Bible itself you have wisdom personified as a woman, thought of as the source by which God will give all the benefits of enlightenment and wisdom and insight. In Buddhism, the prajnaparamita, the wisdom that has gone beyond, wisdom that comes from enlightenment, that will free people from the samsaric cycle, that will allow them not to have to return birth after birth after birth, but will take them to completion, to fulfillment after this life. That prajnaparamita is thought of as a great goddess. She correlates with the subtlety and grace that is necessary for enlightenment. And the Buddhists tell a beautiful story that when enlightenment comes, in order for it to come, and at the moment that it comes, you have to let go. You have to give up, in effect, all of the crutches and all of the things that you have clung to as a human being. Most deeply, you have to give up your notion of a permanent self, of the very core of you. And for most of us, that's just about impossible to do. We'll give up riches, we'll give up friends, we'll give up power. But to let go of the very heart of what we think of as our identity is something that is almost incomprehensible. And Buddhists knew this, and so they pictured the Prajnaparamita as a beautiful goddess who would be there if you would let yourself go, who would be there to catch you the way a mother would catch a child if it were tossed to her. And the notion was that if you can bring yourself to that point of surrender, that you'll find you're not alone. You don't fall into oblivion, but you fall into the arms of a loving mother. Now that was putting it in story form, of course, for something that would be the result of years and years of meditation and discipline. But psychologically, the idea that was being conveyed was that wisdom, the wisdom that you would achieve, would be so all-encompassing, so wonderfully holistic, that the best image they could think of was a maternal one. The way in which a mother would never allow anything to happen to a child, well then so too, if you would have faith and confidence and allow yourself to let go, you would find yourself held by a loving and protecting mother. So that the woman here, as the woman in the Old Testament was the sign of strength, of insight as strength, so here then the strong in Buddhism is the one who's willing to be weak, the one who is willing to let go. And my third example is really from Taoism, the notion of the Tao, T-A-O, although it's pronounced as though it's D-O-W. In ancient China, the Tao was the overarching pattern or impersonal kind of power that guided all life, that in effect was the one with whom one wanted to be in harmony. And while, for the most part, in the writings it is thought of as impersonal, yet the images for it are very interesting, because imaging the Tao, three prime ones: water, thought of as that which as it drips upon rock will slowly but surely wear away the rock. Water that can take any shape and that has in effect almost nothing that it can call its own, yet in that act of silently dripping upon rock, it proves itself more powerful. The second image is the infant. Newborn, absolutely helpless, and yet in total power. What family, especially with the first child, doesn't find itself rearranging its schedule, awakening at the slightest sound of a cry in the middle of the night, doing all kinds of things? A 38-year-old man on the floor, gooing and making these ridiculous little sounds. That's the idea. That the power that the child has is almost limitless. The third image, the woman. In a patriarchal society like ancient China, the man seemed to have all power. He literally, at times, under Confucian rule, would have the power of life or death over his wife. And yet the Taoists took as the symbol of the Tao the woman. Why? Because they knew, if only by the observation of Chinese society, that the real power, the power of persuasion, was in the hands of the woman. That the real power of subtlety and grace was in the hands of the woman. That the culture had so ordained almost by the way in which women and men were treated, that the subtlety necessary for making society work was really the domain of the woman. One of the ways that the Taoists talk about how a society will function is by a term that they call wu-wei, W-U-W-E-I. And that's the power of indirection, what they call actionless action. And the idea here is that if you want someone to do something, you don't argue with them, you don't try to bully them, because it won't work. They're very practical. If you try to use force, the force will only last so long as you're physically present, or so long as you can wield some kind of absolute control. But most people are incapable of keeping that up for very long, so the situation will quickly degenerate or reverse back. But if you convince the other that the task you want done is really in his or her best interest, is really such that it is the right thing to do, then whether or not you're physically present or exerting any kind of control, the person will act. Things go his way, should act in this way of persuasion, of a kind of convincing of the other that the right is what both want, and that the right translates out to be what is being discussed at that moment. And that the model then for that is the woman. One small modern story on that is that when the communists took over in China, this indigenous Taoism and the influence here was still present, because when they went into the little villages, while it was purported to be men in charge in every instance, the Chinese communists knew from their culture that it was the women who really had control. And one of the things when the sociologists got hold of that material and they studied it out, what they saw was that in that society, since it's heavily patriarchal, little boys are allowed to play from birth on. They have almost no restraints on them. Little girls always have a sibling on the hip, usually two, with another one in tow. This is prior to the Chinese communists mandating the limitation of family. But in the traditional family, the little girl always had the youngest babies to take care of. So the little girl, roughly from the age of 4, 5, and 6 on, absolutely had to be able to convince the younger children to do what she wanted to do, or she would never have any playtime. She became a born diplomat, whereas her brothers could go off and play their games, and they never learned these skills. So the little girl grows up with this notion of always saying the equivalent of, "Mommy, Johnny wants an ice cream cone," Johnny being 2.5. Johnny may get 2 licks, but it's pretty sure that the older sister is going to get most of that ice cream cone. Okay? Or convincing the little boy that he wants to play house, or the little girl that she wants to go down to the river, or whatever the task was, so that through adolescence and through adulthood, the women preserved those kind of diplomatic skills. And they needed them in a society where, again, the dominant force in any home was going to be the mother-in-law. So that the young woman coming in had to convince the mother-in-law by her behavior that she was docile, that she was bright, that she was industrious, etc., etc. And then, if that were the case, her marriage was pretty much secure, and until the birth of a child, then she could be ensured that she would be treated with some sort of fairness. In those instances, the communists discovered where she was abused, where either a husband would beat her or a mother-in-law, sometimes the case, would exert physical punishment. The wise woman never complained. She went down, though, to the washing area at the river, and she very discreetly, after she was sure of her women friends, that she had a circle of women friends, she would very discreetly let her bruises show. Thus, angering and puzzling her women friends, who would then ply her with questions until she reluctantly admitted that, let's say for argument, that it was her husband who was causing these bruises. The women in turn then, each would return to her house and make life in that house for her husband just about unbearable, until the men who had total control would get together and gang up on the offending husband and say, "You've got to stop." Okay. Power. Strength through compromise, strength through diplomacy. I'm not giving 100% approval to these. I'm simply stating that over the centuries, women have had far more power, what we would call today covert power, but power nonetheless. Let me bring it now in the last 3 points to more modern conditions. Probably the one perduring notion through our archaic religions, the world religions, and down to modern times has been the fact that until very recently, and this probably is true only in the Western world, primary care of children has been in the hands of women. That throughout most of our world, even today, women are the primary nurturers of young children. If you're familiar with Dorothy Dinnerstein's book, Mermaid and the Minotaur, you'll know the liabilities as well as the assets of that social condition. But the fact is that while anthropologists can discard now among the notions of early religions of that idea of culture and nature dichotomy, saying women are only identified with nature, men with culture, it is still true that in modern society the stereotypes of that linger on, so that for the most part you don't have equality in higher education, for instance, between men and women in terms of the professors. The number of women professors in any given institution is usually far fewer than men. Why? Because higher education is still thought of as a male domain. But trying to emphasize again the positive side, the idea then of women having been associated with children, with the nurturing of children, has meant for most women, and again these are tendencies and I don't mean to exclude men from sharing them, but primarily in our society it's thought that women have and demonstrate a kind of special veneration for life, a kind of concern about life. The objection that women frequently raise to the senseless slaughtering of wartime, the kind of concern for the future, particularly as they often put it, the future of our children and grandchildren, particularly again in questions of nuclear armament or of nuclear power in general. It seems also that women have a special interest in having culture focus on non-competitive activities rather than on ever-increasing competition. The concern that women usually register about individuals rather than statistics or systems or large organizational charts. The concern that women seem always to have and take satisfaction in seeing others grow and flourish. The kind of nurturing that is usually associated with in administration with women in terms of being able to facilitate or being concerned about the progress and flourishing of individuals under that administrator. Again, not trying to be reverse sexism here, but those tendencies, I think, come from the millennia of associating with children, of nurturing children, of having the early training of children under their domain. And those tendencies or traits should not lightly be discarded. We need to form a society where those traits will be valued, will be honored, will be emulated by men. I want to take a little break here and read a passage to you from a novel that I can recommend by Mary Gordon. The title of the book is Men and Angels. And the point in this passage that I'd like you to see from this artist's point of view is some of the points I've been making thus far about the concern of women for children and what kind of a person that produces. This is an extended quote. She looked at the clock. It was 2:30. Soon the children would be home. She waited for the sound of their arrival as if she were dressed for a party, listening for a taxi. No one had told her what it would be like, the way she loved her children. What a thing of the body it was, as physically rooted as sexual desire, but without its edge of danger. The urge to touch one's child, she often thought, was like and wasn't like the hunger that one felt to touch a lover. It lacked the suspense and greed and component parts of insecurity and vanity that made so trying the beloved's near approach. Once the children were in the house, the air became more vivid and more heated. Every object in the house grew more alive. "How I love you," she always wanted to say, "and you can never know it. I would die for you without a thought. You have given my life its sheerest, its profoundest pleasure." But she could never say that. Instead, she would say, "How was school? Was lunch all right? Did you have your math test?" It was such an odd thing, motherhood. She didn't understand how people could say, "She's a good mother," in the same way that she said, "She's a good neurosurgeon," or "She sings well." It wasn't a skill. There was no past practice to be consulted and perfected by strict application and attention to detail. There was no wisdom you could turn to. Every history was inadequate, for each new case was fresh. Each new case was a person born, she was sure of it, with a nature more fixed than modern thought led people to believe. She loved that her children were not clean slates, but had been born themselves. She loved the intransigence of their natures, all that could never be molded, and so was free from her. She liked to stand back a little from her children. It was why people thought her, as a mother, vague. But she respected the fixity of her children's souls, what they had been born with, what she had from the first moments seen. She admired, for example, Peter's fastidiousness. It wasn't only physical, although it had roots in the physical. She admired it even when it exhausted her and made her feel quite futile. Since he could talk, he had come to her in positions of outraged justice with questions that had no answers, although she had agreed with him that they should have. Why did Jessica's father go away and never see her? Why does Amanda like to play with Oliver better than me when I share all my toys and he hogs his? He was always ardent. He took things to heart, and she was proud of his seriousness, his suffering, his fine, inflexible standards. But she wished she could protect him from himself. End of quote. That, in a nutshell, I think, captures all the points about nurturing, about the sensitivity to the individual, about the kind of concern and the inevitable kind of pain that such concern entails. And the heritage of women as mothers, either physical mothers or mothers in the extended sense of their ministry to others in society. That heritage, I think, is one that society needs today as much as it ever did, perhaps more. And in the coming lectures, I want to talk about that more specifically. For my last 2 points tonight, women's opposition to injustice and women's opposition to war, and I am watching the time, I'd like to share with you the thoughts particularly that come out of a case study done by Pauline Turner, who is the wife of Bernard Cook, who was, I think, a past speaker in this series. And the case study is about Nicaraguan women today, really, but dating back to the pre-Somoza days, or before the Somoza turnover and coup. Historically, women have been the weaker sex physically, more vulnerable, more marginalized, more likely not to have the kind of overt power that we say has always been men's in a patriarchal society. And the covert power that I spoke of before, that women use by their subtlety and by their diplomacy, has not in the past spared them the sense of frustration or pain when the overt power of war and injustice has deprived them of husbands, of lovers, and of children. And that women today, because of the kind of sensitivity that they have in marginalized areas, in those areas particularly in Latin America, they have become equal partners with the men in most of the revolutionary activities. And when Pauline Turner visited Nicaragua a few years ago, she documented the statistics and the story of the women in Nicaragua. And I want to briefly recount some of the high points of that story. In 1965, the general atmosphere in Nicaragua was summed up in the expression that said women belonged in the home, la casa, and men in the street, la calle. The street meaning, of course, not just the physical street, but the business world and the political world. The image for women was one of self-sacrificing for children, for the home, and if any extended service was necessary, for the church. The general machismo made the men the ones who were to protect women, but who again had total domination over women. Thus far, that's sort of the general thing that most of us would be very familiar with. The hidden facts, though, in Nicaragua were, in 1965, were things like this. The part of that machismo meant that the poorer men, the men from the lower classes, translated that out to mean their virility, their sense of pride, their sense of identity depended upon their fathering as many children as possible by as many women as possible. Okay? Among the wealthier classes and the better educated classes, it was quite acceptable for the men to have several mistresses. The same sort of idea, but at least those women were physically in slightly better state. Women, though, particularly among those lower classes, that meant for them that they were likely to be pregnant at least 8 times, many times more than that in their lifetime. Now, this is a lifetime which made their life expectancy that of 50 years, so that by 35 they were already quite advanced in middle age. It meant, since the idea was to impregnate as many women as possible, that the typical lower class woman, girl, was pregnant just at puberty or shortly thereafter. Right? And it meant that that was without benefit of clergy or without any of the protections of the law, usually. So that the vast majority of the lower class women, 50% of whom were illiterate, meant that they were single mothers and were probably likely to remain single mothers for most of their short lives. For those lucky enough, quote unquote, to marry, the divorce laws indicated that a man could be sued for divorce only if he had the other woman living in the same house with his legal wife. The only grounds for divorce. Yet, a woman could be divorced, even from the upper class, if she had sexual relations even once outside marriage. By 1965, most single women in the poorer classes with no educational or occupational opportunities were turning to prostitution. Not, of course, by desire, but simply by the need to feed and clothe the children that they had. The National Guard frequently aided this effort, which was, of course, condemned by church and state both, by going to the hillside, to the country, rural areas, and promising the girls that they would be taken care of in homes and doing domestic work, and then taking them immediately to the brothels. So that the general state in 1965 of women and women's position in society was extremely precarious, particularly among the middle and lower classes. Within the church, over the centuries, the cult of Mary had foisted upon them a model of long-suffering purity. Those two virtues. In 1979, with the overthrow of Somoza, the Sandinista government put through civil rights for women, laws about the equality of males and females, laws about the rights of mothers and fathers, laws which guaranteed that men would have to support any children that they fathered, laws which made educational opportunities for the first time available to women. By and large, though, it was probably the change in the church, the effect of Vatican II, that really won the hearts of the women more than even the political changes. Because the women who were being taught by nuns, primarily American, who would go out into the barrios and into the rural areas and take the kinds of notions of Vatican II about the people of God, about the dignity of the human person, about the love of God for each individual, translating that into practical terms for these women, and these same nuns now, under the impetus of Vatican II, educating the women to become teachers of other women, that was the way in which gradually the notion of women and their rights began to permeate the culture. Along with that, of course, was the fact that the women were beginning to talk about the fact that their loved ones were disappearing, that they were beginning to group together and form networks about what could be done about the kinds of covert violence that they were constantly suffering. And the formation of the base communities, of the groups of men and women, Christians frequently led by lay leaders, since the scarcity of priests made their presence not always possible, but these groups of people who would come together to read the scriptures and to apply it to their own situation, began to give them a sense of solidarity, both with their heritage, their Christian heritage, with the teachings of the New Testament, and with their own political realities that they were facing. As this became more and more widespread, Pauline Turner discovered, the image of Mary also changed. And that image now among the people, particularly among the women, was that she stood for strength as well as purity. And that the strength that Mary represented was signalized in times in her own life when she stood at the cross and did not bend. And that they began to use those images of Mary as strong as well as pure. And they turned then that image into a model for their own lives. Turner ends the article not on a completely happy note, because she warns her readers that many of the gains, and the gains are substantial, of these women are of course now threatened again by the fact that the American aid to the Contras is threatening the whole structure there, and that in many instances the women are becoming very disheartened. But she also stresses the fact that the courage and the strength that they have taken, because they see the fight as a fight for themselves and as a fight for their children. Women's opposition to war and to injustice then is as current today as it was at any other time in history. But perhaps because of our own raised consciousness, we can appreciate even better today the words of Adrienne Rich that she wrote back in 1972 about her view, because of the conflict in Vietnam, her view of our society and what it had become. The poem is called Merced. For weeks now, a rage has possessed my body, driving now out upon women and men, now inward upon myself. Walking Amsterdam Avenue, I find myself in tears without knowing which thought forced water to my eyes. To speak to another human becomes a risk. I think of Norman Morrison, the Buddhist of Saigon, the black teacher last week who put himself to death to waken guilt in hearts too numb to get the message. In a world masculinity made unfit for women or men. Taking off in a plane, I look down at the city, which meant life to me, not death, and think that somewhere there, a cold center, composed of pieces of human beings, metabolized, restructured by a process they do not feel, is spreading in our midst and taking over our minds, a thing that feels neither guilt nor rage, that is unable to hate, therefore, to love. To me, that poem speaks probably more poignantly today because of the kind of apathy that seems to paralyze great parts of our society. The sense that with Reagan in charge, for instance, what can you do? Or the sense that the economy, the government, is so far beyond our power to control that what's the use of doing anything? That could be the final paralysis. And therefore it might well be the task that we as women face to offset that apathy with a deeply rooted sense from our own heritage as women that we can do something, that change can be brought about, that what is called for is a dedication to the long haul. Short cures have never been women's lot. We've always known the long nights of sitting up with a sick child, of waiting for a fever to break. So too, I think our task today is to prepare ourselves for the long haul, for doing all the things small, perhaps insignificant, but truly momentous in their cumulative effect. I invite you to that task. I thank you now for your attention, and I again reiterate the desire to have you dialogue. Thank you. Your turn. Probably they would like you to use the microphone because people being able to hear.
I'd just like to ask about the Aboriginals. When you said the men took away the rights from the women, who gave the rights to the women in the first place?
The rights I meant there is R-I-T-E-S. The idea of within the Aboriginal religion, the notion was that the secret services and puberty rites, for instance, rites of passage, that those various kinds of things had come from the ancestors, from what's called the dream time, the earliest creation myths and stories. But and in those creation myths, the idea was that women were the real receivers of those from the gods originally, and that men had stolen them.
Yeah,
Does that
okay.
help?
Yeah, thank you.
What it probably signifies is that at some point a conflict and a sense of hostility there. Now, whether that was reflected, at what point in prehistory that would have occurred, no one would know.
And the women just gave in, or?
Well, probably that they were, when they say stolen, the idea was that they didn't really give in, in the sense that it was some injustice involved, that those rights were by right female. At least that's the sort of interpretation that scholars would put on it. One of the beauties in the Aboriginal notions of religion, though, is that one is increasingly, as one grows older, initiated into different levels, both men and women, of the religion. And the culminating kind of thing is a much more complementary male and female participation. Particularly after, say, menopause, as the women achieve a kind of status and the men achieve a kind of status conveyed by age, that there is a greater sharing. Some of that always among early peoples. The mystery about one another's rights and all was somewhat for dramatic effect. People lived in such close proximity, they very likely knew, even though they sort of pretended not to know what was going on. The pretense was because the belief is that each were centers of power, men and women both, and the power should not mix.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'm not sure how to begin. I guess what I found very lovely about this evening is that what I take to be your support for women owning their traditional sense of power, if you like, the sort of diplomatic knowledge and wisdom, is a very lovely and I think somewhat withheld sense, if you like. I've found in my experience and in the exposure I've had to much feminism that often this kind of sense of a woman's home strength and diplomatic power is mistaken or confused with the image of a woman as a deceiver or mischievous or a sinner, in those lines. And that for myself and for some of my friends, I know that in fact turning to feminist groups or feminist theory or political groups just is not helpful. In fact, it becomes very distressing because there's a sense that there's a need to abandon what is familiar and what seems to be a very peaceful sort of strength and a need to behave completely differently. And yet the vulnerability and the lack of logic to that just doesn't sit well. So it's been very nice for me to hear this from you so clearly tonight.
Thank you. One of the things that I love in Taoism is that very notion, because that idea that if you are a good Taoist, you are whole, integrated. In other words, to be a good Taoist, I should be the very best person I can be, but that means I'm the same in all situations as far as that's humanly possible. So I'm not one thing when I'm with this group and another thing here and still a different person over here, because that kind of fragmentation, the Taoists would say, destroys my own inner integrity. But to be the same to everyone means I have to possess great strength. I have to be very firmly rooted in my own identity. Otherwise I get pulled and torn and fragmented. So that to me is something that I think it's a beautiful model for men and women, but I love to use it as a kind of balance against society's pressure, which says that unless I'm really hard-boiled and hard-nosed and competitive and better than every other man, I'm not going to be effective. Now that's as much probably temperament as anything else, and I don't mean it to be the only word, so you can argue that if you like. Where else?
I was just wondering if you have some reflections on what you think is in the nature of men that they would steal the rights of women, and what you think is in the nature of men that they would use power in terms of control over. Have you done thinking in that?
All right. What I try to do tonight with you is really, as I told you, give you a lot of different angles, facets of this topic, and I'll try here too. Don't make this written in stone in any way, but my impression. I think that the myth that deals with this, the story that talks about women's rights being stolen in that sense, and your other question about men wielding power in that way, to me seem to be somewhat tied, one a modern question, one an ancient one. But what the ancients may have been saying is an observation about male-female relationships. Now I'm extrapolating obviously from modern back, but anthropologists say that, that the ancient peoples were as intelligent and as stupid as we. I mean, there is not a kind of notion any longer that they were subhuman, etc., and therefore we are the epitome of intelligence. that they possess the full range of humanity, at least when we're talking about fully developed people on the evolutionary scale. All right. So the male-female complementarity that is there also, though, necessitates a male-female difference, right? So that I am not male, and I truly then have never been inside the skin of a male, so I cannot appreciate the world as a man does. Now, our humanity that we share gives us complementary insights, but there is still the differences. One of the traits of human beings is that when someone else is different from me, hostility, fear occurs. The other, that sort of notion, right? The other is always a challenge, a possibility of the difference can devolve into a kind of notion that the other then I have to either put down, I have to control, subjugate, denigrate. Look what bigotry is. See? It's whenever we don't really understand another people or another group, we denigrate them in some way. To the extent that we are insecure, we denigrate others to build up our own egos. That sort of thing between the sexes, I think, simply does occur. Right? There is a difference there. Now, if historically the men, whether the male domination was originally because of physical strength, that certainly could be possible. But for whatever reasons it actually occurred, once men have power in a given culture, once it is a patriarchy, just as human beings, they're not going to give up that power easily. They're not going to share it readily. I don't think it would be very different had it all been the opposite way. Had there been, complete matriarchies. I think we would just have the reverse sexism, given human nature as we know it. So that therefore for the complementarity to dominate rather than the hostility, I think you have to have greater cooperation. And in most societies, you didn't really have, especially in the historical societies, as written history becomes, you had groups like the Confucians that really separated the sexes, so much so that I would think that would breed more hostility. Now those are all just kind of pot shots and notions that would play into that. If anybody has any others, feel free to contribute, but at least that would give you some helpful. Okay.
I don't want to ask you a question so much as to make a statement. I really appreciated your quote from the novel, and it made me feel very sad and angry that in fact that is not my experience. I am the mother of 5 children, and when they were all very little, that was not my experience. I feel now, because the patriarchal society forced me into a nuclear family situation where I had no access to the elder women. That's one of the reasons. For economic reasons as well. I feel sad that that is not my experience. I would hope that soon that will be the experience of every mother. In addition, I would like to say that concentrating this nurturing that women seem to be capable of too much on the physical connection between me and my particular child, my heart hurts for the women who are here in this room who have chosen not to be mothers for whatever reason. I come to this university, I'm 46 years old. I had last year and this year female professors who are younger than me. I appreciate that my daughters now mother me. And I felt that I really needed to say that.
That's good. Thank you. Yes. There are 2 things there, just as also response. I probably and I don't mean this defensively especially, picked that passage because that meant so much to me, probably because I'm not a mother. That may go. Yes, but also because I wanted it to represent the second part of what you said, and that is, that's the kind of society we need in which that sense of motherhood can either be given or restored. And I will say more about those sorts of things in the future. But there is a way in which our society has so long now, in the last couple of decades, denigrated mothers by making feminism so tied to the single or the childless couple or the career woman, that a little bit of effort to restore that balance, and again, I don't mean that to be, your point is still very well taken. We've got to get ourselves to the point where that will be possible. I don't want to hold this beyond time. Again, though, I thank you very much, and I hope the dialogue can continue. I appreciate your attention.
Right now, I would like to invite Sister Paul Canton, the General Superior of the Sisters of Charity, to thank our speaker.
By your scholarly presentation, Dr. Carmody, you have brought into sharp focus for us the vision of societies where women's gifts are called forth and used to benefit all humankind. Many changes, we know, need to be effected in our society, and new understanding promoted among us to realize the complementarity of the sexes willed by our Creator. Your talk this evening has given us both the energy and the vision, and the power is within us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Paul. I'd simply like to recall that the lectures will continue tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock when the topic will be feminism and Christianity. For those of you who, and I extend the invitation to all of you actually, who would like to meet Denise and her husband John, and over coffee and conversation, if you'll come down through this door and go to room 405, which is the faculty lounge, you're welcome. So we'll see you tomorrow morning or presently in the faculty lounge. Come and enjoy it.